Hello, friends. This is Jim with Science Talk, and this is kind of an interesting story I'm going to share with you now. Um, Here's the headline: Earth swallowed another planet, and maybe that's why life exists. The ancient collision that formed the moon may also have brought with it all the ingredients needed for life, so indicated in a new study, so claimed in a new study. Over 4.4 billion years ago, a Mars-sized body smashed into the still nascent primitive Earth, spewing out material that eventually became our moon, which then settled into a permanent orbit around our planet. But the new study, and this study appears in the journal Science Advances, finds that this event could have had a much larger impact than previously thought. The collision could also have imbued our planet with the carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur needed for life to form. Oxygen came later as a result of some bacteria that started doing photosynthesis, releasing oxygen, which actually back then was a poison. But eventually it grew in sufficient quantities, and organisms evolved to utilize it and become not a poison, but necessary. Back then, Earth was similar to Mars as Mars is today. It had a core, it had a mantle, but its non-core portion was poor in volatile elements such as nitrogen, carbon, and sulfur. Elements of the non-core parts of our planet, called the bulk silicate Earth, can intermingle with each other, but they never interact with the elements of the core. So some volatiles existed in the core, they couldn't make their way to the planet's outer layers, and then that collision happened. There is a theory that holds that a type of meteorite called carbonaceous chondrites, basically containing carbon compounds, slammed into Earth and gave the bulk silicate Earth these volatile elements. This theory is based on the observation that the ratios of different isotopes of nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen seem to match those found on these types of meteorites. So proponents of the theory argue the meteorite must be the source of those elements. This is one little glitch. The ratio of carbon to nitrogen is slightly off. Doesn't quite in agreement. While the meteorites have about 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, Earth's non-core material has about 40 parts carbon to each part nitrogen. And this is according to the study author Damanveer Grewal, who is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Rice University, which is located in Houston, Texas. So the study authors, they decided to test another theory. What if another planet brought the necessary ingredients? Grewal basically states that Earth could have collided with many different kinds of planets. Could one of those planets have given the bulk silicate Earth the correct proportion of elements? If this collision happened, the two planetary cores would have merged and the two mantles would have merged. So they set out to create a possible planet that could have collided with Earth. So just a little synopsis of the methodology they use. In a lab, they used a type of furnace. Grewal and his team created the high temperature, high pressure conditions under which a planet's core might form. In capsules of graphite, graphite of course is the form of carbon, they combine metallic powder, which represents the core, and includes elements such as iron, bound to nitrogen, with different proportions of silicate powder. Silicate is basically a silicon-oxygen compound, meant to mimic the hypothetical planet's mantle. They varied the temperature, they varied the pressure, they varied the proportions of sulfur in their experiment, creating scenarios of how these elements could have divided between the core and the rest of the hypothetical planet. They found that carbon is much less willing to bond with iron in the presence of high concentrations of nitrogen and sulfur, while nitrogen bonds with iron even when a lot of sulfur is present. So for nitrogen to be excluded from the core and be present in other parts of the planet, it should have contained very high concentrations of sulfur, Rule said. And that's basically the discrepancy that I mentioned a few moments ago. After running over 1 billion simulations, good thing for supercomputers, they found that the scenario that made the most sense, the one that had the most probable timing and could lead to a correct ratio of carbon to nitrogen, was one that posited a collision and merger of Earth with a Mars-sized planet that contained about 25 to 30% sulfur in its core. Celia Dalu states that this theory is very probable. She is an experimental petrologist at the Centre de Recherche Petrographiques et Géochimiques in France. She was not part of the study, but she basically says this seems very likely and very probable. She continues, this work is a very successful result of years of research of various different teams. There you have it. Is it definitive? No. Is it promising? Yes. Is there any way to collect absolute hardcore data to support this? That's probably going to be a little difficult to do. We can't exactly go reach into the mantle and go grab some samples. But like anything else, you can collect data that is very suggestive and very indicative of processes. And so I just find this interesting that another celestial object slamming into Earth could have brought necessary ingredients that would ultimately lead to formation of life here. Thank you for your time. Hey friends, this is Jim reminding you to subscribe and share my videos. Also, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I drop a video in. And I'm also asking for you to please support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your continued support.